Late in the day at Rome's seaport, men whose job is to recognize a ship at a glance keep looking out to sea for a familiar thing. The pale blocks of sailcloth that usually mean Africa has arrived. The light drops, the water turns dark, and the horizon stays clean. No convoy, no shouting dock crews, no ropes creaking under a load of sacks, just an empty strip of sea where the grain ships should be. Rome can handle a late ship. It can handle storms, a bad harvest, even a convoy scattered along the coast. What it cannot handle for long is silence, because a city this large does not live from the fields outside its walls. It lives off the sea and off the expectation that ordinary people will wake tomorrow and find bread again. One missed arrival is an inconvenience. A pattern of missing arrivals is a political emergency. The first fear is not a cinematic rush on the bakeries. It is uncertainty inside government. Officials can release reserves, search for substitute cargoes, and pay whatever frightened merchants demand. But every emergency measure advertises the same weakness. Somebody across the water is deciding how expensive ordinary life in Rome will become. The ships are supposed to come from North Africa. Those provinces send grain and revenue across a short sea lane into Italy, while Egypt's enormous harvest now chiefly serves Constantinople. Sicily and other western regions can help in an emergency, but Africa is close, productive, and organized to provision the old capital. If that route falters, Rome does not starve overnight. The government simply begins losing time, money, and choices. That is enough to make food a political weapon without turning Gildo into a man with a magical switch. The danger lies in duration. Each delayed convoy forces Stilicho to solve tomorrow's supply, while also deciding whether the delay itself is an act of war. In 397, the man in a position to interrupt that route is Gildo, Rome's senior military commander in Africa. He has served the empire for years, commands its troops in the region, and belongs to a family with deep local power. Orders carrying his seal matter immediately. Orders from Italy first have to cross the sea, reach the right officials, and find soldiers willing to enforce them. When African grain stops moving normally, the Western court cannot treat it as a shipping problem. It has to deal with Gildo. That is what makes the empty horizon unsettling. No foreign fleet has blockaded the coast. No barbarian army has seized Carthage. A Roman officer, governing Roman provinces with Roman soldiers, has discovered that obedience can be withheld in small practical decisions until the people above him are forced to negotiate. The government in the West belongs formally to Honorius, a boy emperor, while the soldier politician Stilicho does much of the governing around him. In Constantinople, Honorius's older brother Arcadius presides over another Roman court with its own ministers and suspicions. Both courts still claim to govern one empire, but Gildo has learned that their rivalry creates room for a provincial commander to maneuver. He can reject Western authority while presenting himself as loyal to the emperor in the East. To modern ears, that can sound like changing countries. It was messier. Gildo could keep using the language of Roman loyalty while disputing which Roman court had the right to command Africa, and both courts could use him against the other without admitting that the imperial family itself had fractured. That leaves Stilicho with a trap. If he tolerates Gildo, he shows every powerful commander that the capital's food can be used as leverage. If he attacks, he sends an army into the provinces whose harvest he needs to protect. Armies consume supplies, pull labor from fields, and turn local disputes into armed choices. Even victory can damage what it was meant to recover. Gildo does not need to invade Italy. He only needs to make Stilicho choose between humiliation and a dangerous war. There is a personal insult inside the strategic one. Gildo's authority came from the same empire he is now defying, and Stilicho is being challenged by a subordinate who believes distance, wealth, and divided courts make punishment impossible. Yet power like that was not created in 397. To see where it came from, the story has to go back 20 years, to an earlier rebellion inside Gildo's own family. The earlier rebel was Firmus, one of Gildo's brothers. Their father Nubal had been a powerful Mori leader within the Roman world, and his death left land, clients, armed followers, and several ambitious sons. A violent inheritance quarrel widened into a confrontation with Roman officials. Firmus had killed his half-brother Zamac, and the African commander Romanus used the killing to move against him, while Firmus's attempts to defend himself at court went nowhere. Cornered by a government that seemed determined to condemn him, Firmus revolted. Romanus was already notorious in the province for corruption and for failing communities that had asked him for military help. That history gave Firmus more than a family grievance. People who had learned not to expect justice from the government could see rebellion as protection, opportunity, or revenge. This was not a desert outsider suddenly charging Rome. Firmus already possessed the things rebellion requires: relatives, local allies, mobile fighters, fortified places, and grievances that other people could adopt as their own. His wealthy sister Syria helped finance support, and men who had suffered under Romanus had reasons to listen. Ammianus even preserves the theatrical moment when a Roman military necklace was placed on Firmus's head like a diadem. The gesture mattered because the revolt had outgrown a private feud. Towns, tribal leaders, and Roman units now had to decide whether this man might actually win. Once imperial soldiers defected and cities opened their gates, every success became an argument for the next ally to join. The Emperor Valentinian sent an experienced general across the sea to stop him. Theodosius the Elder, father of the future Emperor Theodosius I and grandfather of Honorius and Arcadius. He arrived with a relatively compact body of court troops and a reputation made on other frontiers. Surprise and authority had to compensate for numbers. Africa offered him no simple march to one decisive battle. Heat, water, distance, ambushes, and shifting alliances all favored an enemy who could disappear into country he knew better than the soldiers pursuing him. Theodosius needed local troops and information, but every local ally brought loyalties of his own into camp. The family split across the war. Gildo worked with Theodosius and carried out sensitive assignments under Roman orders. Mascezel did not begin on that side. Ammianus names him, with another brother called Dius, among forces fighting the Romans. At one point, those brothers led light-armed men against the imperial advance, while Gildo served the general hunting Firmus. That detail makes the later story harsher, not tidier. These brothers were not born into permanent roles as loyalist, rebel, hero, and villain. They learned to survive by reading power, changing position, and understanding how quickly Rome could turn yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's instrument. Theodosius did not win by marching straight at every stronghold. He negotiated, threatened, offered pardons, paid for defections, and punished resistance when persuasion failed. Firmus could raid, burn fields, and appear where heavier troops were uncomfortable, but his coalition depended on the belief that following him remained safer than abandoning him. The Roman general worked directly on that belief. Envoys carried offers to tribal leaders. Money and fear separated men who had entered the revolt for different reasons. Each surrendered town and detached ally weakened the rest. Gildo was useful because he could operate inside this world of family connections and local authority, while serving the commander who still possessed the empire's resources and the power to pardon. Eventually, Firmus ran out of room. His forces scattered, refuge followed refuge, and protection became a negotiation conducted over his body. A local ruler sheltering him agreed to hand him over. Firmus discovered the agreement and chose suicide, by hanging rather than delivery to the Romans. His corpse was carried to Theodosius, reportedly slung over a pack animal, and exposed so the general could confirm that the hunt was truly over. Theodosius then returned to Sisyphus in the posture of a victor. The revolt had not ended in a magnificent last stand. It ended when an ally calculated the price of surrendering one man, and Firmus understood that nowhere remained safe. Gildo came out of that collapse on the winning side. Ammianus shows Theodosius sending him to arrest a senior Roman officer, and later receiving hostile leaders delivered through him. These were not decorative errands. They placed Gildo inside the decisions about who would be detained, punished, protected, and trusted after the revolt. Mascezel had seen the same machinery from the other side and survived it. All three brothers had learned the lesson that would return in 398. An African coalition can look immovable until its members decide that loyalty has become more dangerous than betrayal. Gildo also learned the profitable half of the lesson: stand beside the power distributing pardon when the reckoning begins. For Gildo, service during the Firmus revolt became the beginning of a much larger career. By the mid-380s, he held the senior military command in Africa. Authority he would retain for roughly 12 years. The title mattered because it placed the provincial army under him. His family background mattered because he was not merely an appointee who had arrived with a trunk of letters. He possessed local standing of his own, and Roman office amplified it. That combination made him difficult to replace. Governors and judges still existed, cities still had councils, and commands still came from emperors. But when force was required, troops moved, a road secured, a disturbance suppressed, the man commanding the soldiers became part of every serious calculation. Gildo did not have to perform every task personally. Years in command meant that officers, communities, and local leaders grew accustomed to making their arrangements in a world where he remained, and distant ministers changed. His wealth grew with his authority. The hostile writers who describe him are eager to make every estate evidence of greed, so their moral portrait deserves care. The scale of the property confiscated after his fall nevertheless shows that this was no ordinary salaried officer. Land produced rents and food. Wealth maintained a household, rewarded service, and made friendship with Gildo materially useful. Official command gave him soldiers, while property and family connections gave him influence that did not vanish when an imperial letter arrived. This is the practical core of his power. Gildo was not secretly building a modern independent state inside Africa. He was becoming indispensable inside Roman government. He could describe every act as service to an emperor, even while ensuring that service in Africa ran through him. By the time Honorius inherited the West, Gildo had outlasted ministers, campaigns, and changes at court. A new government could dismiss him in principle. Making that dismissal real would require someone in Africa with enough troops and allies to enforce it. That distinction explains why Stilicho could not solve the later crisis with a stern order. Gildo was dangerous precisely because he had spent years as a legitimate Roman commander. His soldiers had not joined an outlaw in the hills. They had obeyed the man the empire itself had placed above them. When he finally challenged the Western court, he carried Roman authority, African wealth, and a long habit of obedience into the break. Then the structure above him changed. Emperor Theodosius I died in 395, leaving the empire governed in the names of his sons, Honorius in the west, still a child, and Arcadius in the east, older but still young. This was not the instant creation of two foreign countries. Laws, offices, armies, and family ties still belonged to a Roman imperial system. But decisions now came from two courts, and the powerful adults around each emperor competed over whose commands would prevail. In the west, Stilicho stood closest to the machinery of war. He was an experienced commander, married to Theodosius's niece Serena, and responsible for protecting Honorius. Stilicho claimed that the dead emperor had entrusted him with a wider guardianship over both sons, a claim the Eastern court had every reason to resist. To Western supporters, he was the man keeping government together. To enemies in Constantinople, he looked like a general, using a child emperor and an army to reach beyond his proper sphere. Arcadius had powerful ministers of his own. Among them was Eutropius, the Grand Chamberlain, who controlled access to the emperor and became the dominant figure at court. There was no reason for him to regard Stilicho as a neutral colleague. Every expansion of Stilicho's influence threatened the men whose power depended on keeping the Eastern Palace beyond his reach. A dispute over an African commander could therefore become part of a much larger struggle over who spoke for the imperial family. This rivalry worked through Roman law rather than through declarations between separate nations. Each court could claim loyalty to the dynasty, issue orders in an emperor's name, and portray the other side's strongman as the real danger. A provincial officer who disliked one set of commands could appeal to the other. The system offered Gildo something Firmus had never possessed, a rival imperial government under whose authority resistance to the West might be disguised as obedience to Rome. Africa made the gamble worth attempting. Its taxes mattered, its army mattered, and its grain reached Italy quickly enough to turn political delay into pressure on Rome. Gildo controlled the force on the ground, while two courts disputed the right to command him. After years of learning how much distant governments depended on his cooperation, he chose to test that dependence. The disruption at the beginning of this story was the material edge of that choice. Gildo broke with Honorius's administration and attempted to attach himself and the African provinces under his control to Arcadius's government. The grain route became leverage because he already commanded the port's military hinterland and the troops officials would need in order to defy him. Whether every ship stopped is less important than the political fact Stilicho could not ignore. Supplies from Africa were no longer moving under secure Western authority. For Gildo, Eastern recognition could transform rebellion into an argument about jurisdiction. He could tell officers and cities that he had not rejected the imperial house. He had chosen the emperor whose orders were legitimate. For the ministers around Arcadius, encouraging distance between Africa and Stilicho weakened a rival without sending an Eastern army across the Mediterranean. Nobody needed to say aloud that Rome's food was a weapon. The delayed grain and the competing seals said it for them. The Western response was deliberately public. The Roman Senate declared Gildo an enemy of the state, converting a struggle over obedience into a legal demand that soldiers and officials abandon him. The Eastern court, meanwhile, treated Stilicho as the dangerous overreacher. The symmetry was grotesque. One Roman government branded Gildo the enemy, while another attacked the authority of the man preparing to remove him, and both young emperors remained members of the same dynasty. This was the point at which the opening trap tightened. If Stilicho launched a vast reconquest, he risked prolonged fighting across the province he needed intact. If he waited, Gildo gained time to make Eastern protection feel permanent and Western commands irrelevant. The answer would have to break Gildo's political hold faster than a conventional invasion could destroy his army. Fortunately for Stilicho, the man best placed to attempt that had just become Gildo's enemy. His name was Mascezel. Years after surviving the War of Firmus, he broke with Gildo and escaped to the west. He was not arriving as a stranger who had studied Africa on a map. He belonged to the same family, knew the society in which Gildo's power operated, and understood that the apparent unity around his brother rested on choices made by Roman officers and local allies. Stilicho now had access to someone who could turn an imperial expedition into another African family war. Mascezel's departure placed him in an exposed position. Gildo could no longer trust a brother who had reached the court preparing action against him, while Mascezel could no longer return safely and negotiate as if nothing had happened. His value to Stilicho made him more dangerous to Gildo with every conversation in Italy. It also left people Mascezel loved inside territory his brother controlled. The surviving accounts give us no private scene in which Mascezel explains himself to Stilicho. His usefulness was obvious without one. He understood the commanders and communities on whom Gildo depended. He could present the Western expedition as a restoration of imperial authority led by an African, not the conquest of Africa by an outsider. Above all, his presence gave uncertain soldiers a living alternative from the same powerful family. Gildo answered that threat through Mascezel's children. 2 of Mascezel's sons remained within his reach, and Gildo had them killed. The sources do not preserve their last moments or their father's first reaction. The political meaning requires no invented dialogue. Their deaths warned every family around Gildo that defection would be punished through the people left behind. For Mascezel, accommodation was now nearly impossible. He had crossed the sea as an exile with useful knowledge. He would return as a commander whose sons had been murdered on his brother's orders. Personal vengeance and Western strategy had become the same road. Stilicho could trust that Gildo would not buy this commander back. Gildo himself had removed that uncertainty. The crisis changed shape. It was still about Africa, grain, and the authority of 2 courts, but it now had a human line the audience could follow all the way to the battlefield. Gildo had once helped Rome destroy one brother, and Rome would now send another brother to destroy him. Stilicho's task was to give Mascezel enough force to make that threat real, without turning Africa into the long, hungry war they both needed to avoid. A massive expedition could become its own disaster. More ships, horses, and soldiers meant more preparation, more requisitioning, and more warning for Gildo. Once ashore, a large army would have to feed itself from the same country the West wanted producing grain again. Stilicho therefore chose a limited force aimed less at occupying every town than at breaking the confidence that held Gildo's coalition together. Honorius, writing later, gives the expedition about 5,000 selected soldiers. The precise figure belongs to his account, but the important contrast is secure. Mascezel did not cross with an overwhelming host. He carried a disciplined nucleus, strong enough to survive a landing and visible enough to offer Gildo's Roman troops another side. If those troops remained loyal, 5,000 men could be isolated and destroyed. If they hesitated, Gildo's much larger structure might collapse before numbers decided anything. The campaign rested on a sharp political wager. Gildo's army included Roman units serving under a Roman commander who now opposed the Western government. Some officers may have owed him careers, protection, or pay. They still had to decide whether those obligations were worth being condemned with him. Converting every supporter was unnecessary. Mascezel needed the first visible defection, because the safest choice for everyone else would change the instant Gildo stopped looking inevitable. Honorius's name appeared on the orders, but Stilicho arranged the response and placed Mascezel in command. That choice allowed the court to use the feud, rather than pretend it did not exist. The man walking toward the ships knew Africa, knew his opponent, and could promise wavering soldiers that returning to Western obedience did not require surrendering to a foreign conqueror. He was also carrying a grief no ceremonial speech could imitate. The risk remained enormous. Gildo held the ground, commanded the existing African forces, and had years of relationships behind him. Mascezel had a small expedition, and the hope that those relationships were conditional. Everything depended on what happened when the 2 brothers' claims became physical. 2 standards in sight of the same soldiers, 2 possible futures close enough to compare. So the ships left Italy carrying selected infantry, their officers, and a commander being watched by everyone aboard. On a small expedition, there is little distance between the man giving orders and the men expected to die for them. Soldiers could see whether Mascezel ate, slept, prayed, or stared too long toward the southern horizon. He was crossing back to the country where his sons had been killed, and he had to make certainty look stronger than grief. Along the route, Mascezel stopped at Capraria and took monks aboard. They brought no cavalry and no siege equipment. What they offered was ritual, fixed hours, fasting, prayer, and the suggestion that this dangerous return belonged to a larger order than family revenge. In a campaign that would turn on confidence, the religious atmosphere around Mascezel was not useless decoration. Armies watch commanders for signs, and commanders know it. Mascezel joined the monks in fasting and prayer. Some soldiers may have found that reassuring, and others strange, but all of them could see it. His discipline became public theatre without needing to be staged as theatre. The commander refusing comfort, the holy men keeping their hours, weapons stacked beside men singing through the night. The force was small enough for conviction, or panic, to travel quickly from one deck to the next. The sources do not preserve a clean description of exactly where Mascezel landed, or how the first hours ashore unfolded. What survives is the speed of the result. The expedition established itself, moved inland, and approached the confrontation before Gildo could turn his advantages into a long campaign. That silence in the record is useful discipline. There is no need to invent a heroic charge off the beach when the real drama lies in what happened after the armies met. Every community along the route nevertheless faced a practical choice. Gildo had been the established commander for years. Mascezel arrived under Western authority with too few troops to make loyalty automatic. Perfect information was unavailable, so towns and officers judged who would still possess soldiers tomorrow. Each gate opened, each supply handed over, and each message sent to Gildo became a wager on which brother was about to survive. Honorius supplies the most explosive religious episode, and he places it after the expedition had reached Africa. With the opposing armies facing one another across a river, Mascezel dreamed of Ambrose, the recently dead bishop of Milan. In the vision, Ambrose struck the ground 3 times, marking the place and the 3rd day for victory. That does not make the supernatural event independently verifiable. It makes the story part of what soldiers and later readers believed about a campaign already waiting for a sign. For men facing a larger force in hostile territory, the dream turned fear into a schedule. The 3rd day was no longer simply another morning on which Gildo might attack. It was a promised ending. Literal belief from every soldier was unnecessary. What mattered was that Mascezel's line held together long enough for doubt to begin spreading on the other side. Mascezel's best advantage was not secret tactical knowledge. It was that he was African, belonged to the same political world as Gildo, and understood the kind of force standing against him. He was not attempting to conquer the province mile by mile. The object was to reach Gildo's army while its Roman units could still imagine pardon, and while Allied fighters could still decide that this was not their war to lose. Gildo knew the landing had happened. Riders and coastal traffic made secrecy impossible, and the name attached to the expedition told him what kind of danger was approaching. A Western general from Italy might be delayed, misled, or isolated. Mascezel could speak directly to the men whose loyalty mattered, and could turn every memory of Firmus's collapse into a warning. Gildo gathered his Roman troops and Mari allies for a decision, rather than allowing that warning to spread indefinitely. The 2 forces came together near a river. Mascezel's line was smaller, but compact. Gildo possessed more men, familiar ground, and the authority under which many of them had served for years. Yet Gildo's size concealed the central weakness of his position. Roman soldiers in his ranks were being asked to fight other Roman soldiers for a commander whom the Western government had declared an enemy. The battle would reveal whether his personal power could survive that contradiction. For several days, the armies remained close enough to measure one another. Mascezel needed discipline and a chance to speak. Gildo needed a display of loyalty strong enough to prevent private calculations from becoming public movement. The river and the waiting mattered because men could see both alternatives. Nobody had yet been forced to commit, which meant every standard, every shouted order, and every hesitation carried more weight than usual. On the decisive day, Mascezel brought his men forward and addressed the troops opposite him, offering a route back to imperial obedience. This was not mercy offered to Gildo. It was aimed at the soldiers, whose future depended on choosing correctly before the fighting made choice impossible. Honorius then gives us the incident around which the entire battle has been remembered. A standard-bearer in Gildo's line resisted. Mascezel struck him on the arm, and the wounded man let the standard dip. The blow was small compared with what thousands of armed men were prepared to do, but the object in his hand made it visible across the field. A lowered standard could look like submission. In Honorius's telling, men already waiting for permission to change sides read it exactly that way. Other units began lowering their own standards and yielding. Once the first movement looked collective, the calculation changed for everybody watching. A soldier who stayed loyal to Gildo might become the last condemned man in a line that had accepted pardon. Officers could shout, threaten, and try to restore formation, but each sign of panic confirmed the fear driving the next defection. An army held together by confidence was coming apart in public. The private arithmetic was brutal. Fight for Gildo and win, and a man might keep his position. Fight for him and lose, and the Senate's declaration made him an enemy beside his commander. Step back while others defected, and there was at least a chance of forgiveness. Mascezel did not create those choices with one sword stroke. The dipped standard made thousands of men realize at the same moment that everyone else was choosing too. Once Gildo's Roman units began yielding, his wider coalition lost its center. Allied fighters had joined the man who controlled Africa, not sworn themselves to die for him after that control disappeared. Some scattered, others looked for terms. Whether the standard incident caused the collapse or simply gave a dramatic shape to loyalties already breaking, the political mechanism is clear. Gildo could command obedience, while he represented the safest future. Mascezel had made another future visible. Mascezel's selected troops advanced into the failure rather than trying to defeat every man individually. Ground was taken, weapons surrendered, and the force that had looked numerically dominant ceased behaving like one army. This was the limited victory Stilicho had gambled on. Not the devastation of Africa, but the rapid transfer of obedience away from Gildo. The campaign was decided before it could become the long war that threatened the grain route. Gildo saw the decision move through his army. Roman units stepped away from his standards. Allies who had depended on his protection began protecting themselves. Orders that would once have crossed a camp now vanished into noise. He could no longer punish enough men to make the others afraid, and he could no longer reward them with a future they believed in. The commander who had made himself indispensable in Africa was suddenly a fugitive inside it. He broke for the coast and found a ship. There was no time to rebuild a line or discover which inland stronghold might still open its gates. Mascezel had not merely won a field. He had made every harbour official and local notable reconsider what friendship with Gildo was now worth. The only safety left appeared to be open water and the Eastern world whose recognition had encouraged his gamble. The vessel pushed away with Gildo and whatever attendants could leave with him. For a brief moment the coastline began to recede, and escape still looked possible. The same sea that had carried African grain toward Italy might now carry the man who disrupted it beyond Mascezel's reach. Behind him, however, there was no army left to guarantee that any port would welcome his return. Then the weather delivered the reversal ancient storytellers could hardly have designed better. An adverse wind prevented the ship from carrying Gildo to safety and drove it back toward the African coast. The man who had tried to pull Africa toward the eastern court could not get himself across the water. Landmarks he had hoped to leave behind came back into view, and every mile of returning shoreline belonged increasingly to his brother's victory. The ship was forced back to Tabrica, where Gildo was captured. He died soon afterward. Accounts differ over the final mechanism, execution or death by his own hand, but they agree on the shape of the ending. The escape failed, Confinement replaced command, and the province he had tried to bargain with became the place from which he could not get away. The uncertainty needs stating once. It does not weaken the reversal. With Gildo dead, victory became administration with sharp edges. Officials moved through his estates and storehouses, broke seals, opened chests, and recorded property before clients could disperse it. The confiscations reveal the material scale of the power he had accumulated. Land, money, agents, and documents that had tied people to Gildo were transferred back toward Honorius's government. The Western Court had recovered more than a defeated province. It had recovered revenue, military obedience, and the security of the African supply route without first exhausting the country in a long occupation. Grain could move again under Western authority. Stilicho's small expedition had worked with startling speed, and the brother selected to lead it returned to Italy, carrying the kind of success that courts celebrate, and sometimes fear. Mascezel came back as the man who had solved Stilicho's crisis. He had crossed with a small force, broken Gildo's coalition, avenged his sons, and restored Africa before the campaign could consume the thing it was meant to save. Honorius's government received the victory, and Stilicho could claim credit for choosing the right instrument. But Mascezel now possessed the dangerous glow of a commander whose name had become larger than his official place. Not long afterward, Mascezel was travelling with Stilicho when the party reached a river crossing. Here the secure narrative ends, and an ugly allegation begins. Zosimus, writing later and hostile to Stilicho, claims that the guards received a signal and pushed Mascezel from the bridge. It is an accusation built to fit the politics. The useful brother had won, returned, and become expendable. Its neatness is precisely why it must remain an accusation. An accidental fall is possible. So is hostile invention around a death that happened near the most powerful man in the West. A deliberate killing is possible too, but the surviving allegation cannot prove motive simply by supplying one. What matters for the ending is that suspicion became attached to Stilicho's victory. The court had needed Mascezel when Gildo controlled Africa. After Africa was secure, later readers could believe the same court wanted him gone. However it happened, Mascezel went into the river during the journey with Stilicho and did not come back out. Not long before, he had crossed a more dangerous stretch of water to face the brother who murdered his sons. He survived the landing, the smaller army, and the collapse of Gildo's force, only to die beside the government that had sent him. The grain ships could sail again. Gildo was dead. Mascezel was dead. Stilicho kept the victory.